One question at dawn: can I stay? Shatters a fortress of solitude. What begins as mercy becomes the fiercest love in a land that takes everything. The silence of the adobe was absolute, a presence as tangible as the thick, earthen walls that held it. Caleb moved through the two small rooms with the economy of a man long accustomed to his own company. His bed, a simple cot in the corner, was made for one, the blanket pulled tight. A single lamp on a crude wooden table kept its oil, its wick untrimmed, as the vast, star-dusted night of the desert offered all the light he needed through the open door. His rifle rested on pegs near the hearth, cleaned and ready, a tool as familiar to his hands as the wooden spoon he used to stir his beans. He had built this place himself, brick by sun-baked brick, near the only reliable spring for 50 miles. It was a life scraped from the dust, a solitary fortress against the ghosts of a world he'd left behind. The heat of the day still radiated from the packed earth floor, a warmth that did little to touch the cold stillness inside him. He ate his supper standing, looking out at the jagged black silhouettes of the mesas against the indigo sky. The only sound was the low hum of insects, a sound that amplified the profound quiet of his existence. He wanted for nothing, because he allowed himself to need nothing. After washing his single plate and cup, he latched the heavy wooden door. The solid thud of the bar falling into place was a nightly ritual, the final declarative beat of a day lived in deliberate isolation. He did not know that the barrier he had so carefully constructed was about to be tested, not by a force he could fight, but by a quiet question from a girl who had lost everything. She appeared with the dawn, a silhouette materializing from the shimmering heat already rising from the desert floor. She was small and thin, her clothes little more than sun-bleached rags hanging from a frame that spoke of long hardship. She walked with a slow, deliberate gait, not of weakness, but of one conserving the last dregs of her strength. Caleb had watched her approach for the last mile, his hand resting on the rifle by the door, his posture a study in wary stillness. He was not a man easily surprised. He saw the intricate beadwork on her worn moccasins, the proud set of her jaw, the exhaustion that warred with a fierce, defiant spark in her dark eyes. She was Apache, and she was alone. She stopped a respectful distance from his door, her gaze taking in the adobe, the small tilled garden, the mule in its corral. It was a survey, an assessment of resources, of the man who controlled them. He remained in the doorway, a silent, unmoving obstacle. Finally, she met his gaze, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy as the desert air. Her voice, when it came, was raspy from thirst but clear, the English words carefully chosen. "My people are gone," she said, the statement flat, devoid of self-pity, a simple declaration of a world ended. She lifted her chin, the gesture infused with a pride that defied her ragged state. "Can I stay?" It was not a plea, but a proposal, an offering of her presence in exchange for survival. Caleb's entire existence was built on solitude. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to send her on her way, to preserve the hard-won peace he had built. But he looked into her eyes, and he saw not an intruder, but a survivor. He saw the echo of his own deep-seated loneliness, the reflection of a soul that had also seen its world burn. He thought of the endless, unforgiving expanse of desert behind her. To turn her away was a death sentence. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped back from the door, an unspoken invitation. She hesitated for only a moment before walking past him into the cool, shadowed interior of the adobe. The door remained open, but the profound, unbroken solitude of Caleb's life had just come to an end. The first days were a silent negotiation of space. He gave her the cot, taking a bedroll for himself on the floor by the hearth. He offered her food and water, which she accepted with a quiet nod, eating slowly, deliberately, as if reteaching her body to accept sustenance. Her name, he learned, was Iska, She offered it to him on the second day, her voice a little stronger, and he gave her his in return. They were the only words that passed between them for nearly a week. He went about his daily routines, tending the garden, checking his traps, reinforcing the corral, and she watched him. Her eyes missed nothing. The way he saved and reused every drop of water, the careful way he cleaned his tools, the habit he had of scanning the horizon. She did not make herself small or invisible. She simply existed within the space, a quiet, observant presence. He, in turn, afforded her the same courtesy. He never approached her without making his footsteps known, never stood too close, never asked the questions that burned in his mind about the fate of her people. He respected her silence as a shield, much like his own. He left a pile of his worn shirts on a stool, along with a needle and thread. He said nothing, simply left them there. The next day, he found them neatly folded, the tears mended with stitches so small and precise they were nearly invisible. It was her first contribution, her first quiet claim to a place in this small world. One afternoon, he returned from checking the perimeter of his land to find her standing over his small vegetable patch, her expression unreadable. He had a shotgun in his hands, and as he approached, he uncocked it and offered it to her stock first, leaning it against the wall before he came any closer. It was a gesture of trust, a clear signal that he did not see her as a threat. She acknowledged it with a slight nod, then pointed to the struggling corn stalks. Using a series of gestures, she explained that the soil was too hard, that the water was running off instead of sinking in. She then knelt and, using her bare hands, began to build a small circular berm of earth around the base of one plant, creating a basin to hold the precious water. He watched her for a moment, then fetched his spade and knelt beside her, mirroring her actions. They worked together under the hot sun, their shared task a conversation more meaningful than any words. Their life slowly found a new rhythm, a harmony of two instead of a solo. The language of gestures and shared tasks began to build a fragile bridge between them. Iska proved to have a deep, ingrained knowledge of the land. She showed him which wild plants were edible, where to find clay that could be used to seal the water barrels, how to read the signs of a coming dust storm. In return, he shared his resources without reservation. He taught her how to use his rifle, showing her how to load, aim, and clean it. He placed the weapon in her hands, his touch careful as he adjusted her grip, a silent transfer of power and trust. She was a quick study, her focus absolute. After she hit the target he'd set up 3 times in a row, she handed the rifle back to him, hilt first, her expression serious. A silent acknowledgement of the trust he had placed in her. He began to leave a second cup on the table in the mornings. She began to have a hot meal ready for him when he returned from his work. They were small things, but in the quiet world of the adobe, they were declarations. One evening, she was grinding corn with a smooth stone, the rhythmic sound a soft counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. She had been humming a low, mournful tune that he had never heard before. When she noticed him watching, she fell silent, her hands stilling. He wanted to tell her not to stop, that the sound had been a welcome intrusion into the silence, but he didn't have the words. Instead, he simply picked up a piece of leather he was braiding into a new rein for the mule, and sat across the room from her, his own quiet work a companion to hers. After a few moments, she began to grind the corn again, and a few minutes after that, the soft, low humming resumed. Later that night, he was awakened by a sound from her corner of the room. He sat up, his senses on high alert. It was a small, choked sob, quickly suppressed. He remained on his bedroll, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. He did not go to her, did not intrude on her private grief. Instead, he simply lay awake, his presence a silent, protective vigil in the darkness, until the quiet, even rhythm of her breathing told him she had found sleep again. In the morning, her eyes were shadowed, but she met his gaze with her usual proud composure. As he handed her a cup of water, he spoke her name. Iska, his voice softer than he intended. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, but it was enough. The longing began as a low, quiet hum beneath the surface of his daze. It was in the way he found his eyes lingering on her as she worked, the efficient grace of her movements, the way the firelight caught the blue-black sheen of her hair. He started to notice the small things. A new, intricate braid she wove into her hair, the way she would pause her work to watch a hawk circle in the sky, the quiet sigh she would let out at the end of a long day. His solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a hollow ache. The 2 rooms of the adobe, which had always felt more than sufficient, now seemed to shrink, charged with a new, unspoken tension. He found himself manufacturing reasons to be near her, showing her how to repair a broken trap or sharpen a knife, just to be able to share a small space with her. He was acutely aware of the scent of sage and dust that clung to her, a scent that was becoming synonymous with the idea of home. One evening, a summer monsoon swept across the desert, the sky opening up with a sudden, violent deluge. The temperature dropped, and a chill seeped through the thick adobe walls. The roar of the rain was deafening, isolating them completely. Iska was sitting by the hearth, wrapping a thin blanket around her shoulders, a slight shiver running through her. Caleb got up and took the heavy wool blanket from his own bedroll. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to her. "You're cold," he said, the words a plain statement of fact. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the flickering firelight. He held out the blanket, a clear offer. She gave a small nod, a silent consent. He carefully unfolded the blanket and draped it around her shoulders, his fingers brushing against her neck. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the fine texture of her hair. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. He just nodded, his throat suddenly tight, and retreated to his side of the room. But the space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of that fleeting touch, with the heat of a shared, unspoken awareness. The storm raged outside, but a different kind of storm was gathering within the quiet walls of the adobe, a tempest of yearning that threatened to break through his stoic control. The world intruded in the form of a man named Flint. He was a prospector, or so he claimed, with eyes that were too shifty and a smile that never reached them. He rode up to the adobe one sweltering afternoon, his horse and gear looking worn and desperate. Caleb met him outside, his stance relaxed but wary. Flint's eyes slid past Caleb to the open doorway, where Iska stood partially concealed in the shadows. His gaze lingered, greedy and speculative. "Get you a woman to go with the claim?" Flint asked, his voice slick with insinuation. "An Apache. Got a taste for the wild, do you?" Caleb's hand tightened into a fist at his side. He stepped slightly to the side, blocking Flint's view of the door. "State your business," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold. Flint's gaze flickered back to Caleb, a flicker of resentment in his eyes. "Just looking for water. Heard there was a spring hereabouts." "There is," Caleb said. "Water your horse. Take what you can carry. Then move on." The dismissal was absolute. While Flint's horse drank greedily from the trough, the man's eyes roamed over Caleb's small homestead, cataloging every detail. He saw the tidy garden, the solid corral, the well-maintained adobe. It was a look of covetous appraisal. "Nice setup for a squatter," Flint remarked. "This is deeded land," Caleb replied, his voice still level. It was a lie. The land was his by sweat and effort, not by any piece of paper, but it was a necessary one. Flint smirked. "Deeds can get lost, especially when a man's all alone out here." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. He finished watering his horse, his eyes making one last sweep, lingering again on the doorway. "I'll be seeing you," he said, swinging into his saddle. It was a promise. As he rode off, Iska stepped out from the shadows, her hand gripping a small knife Caleb hadn't seen her pick up. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She looked at Caleb, and in her eyes he saw a shared understanding. The fragile peace of their world had been shattered. A predator was now circling their sanctuary, and he saw her not as a person, but as something to be taken. The unspoken bond between them solidified in that moment, tempered by the heat of a mutual threat. Flint's presence lingered like a foul smell on the wind. A few days after his visit, Caleb found one of his traps sprung and the catch stolen, the tracks of Flint's horse the only signature left behind. It was a petty act of aggression, a reminder that he was being watched. The unspoken tension in the adobe grew, but it also drew them closer. They began to move as a unit, a silent team. When Caleb went out to check the perimeter, Iska would watch from the roof of the adobe, the rifle resting in her lap. When she went to forage for roots, he would track her from a distance, a ghost in the rocks, ensuring her safety. Their communication became more urgent, a mix of her native Athabascan, his sparse English, and the sign language they had developed. One evening he was cleaning his pistol by the lamplight, the methodical task calming his frayed nerves. Iska was sharpening the small knife she now always carried, the scrape of stone against steel a soft, rhythmic sound. "He will come back," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I know," Caleb replied, not looking up from his work. "He wants the water. He wants this place." He paused and finally met her gaze. "He wants you." Her hand stilled on the whetstone. She nodded, her expression grim. The honesty of his words, the refusal to soften the ugly truth, was a sign of respect. He saw her not as something fragile to be shielded, but as a partner in their defense. He finished cleaning the pistol, the metallic clicks of the cylinder spinning home loud in the quiet room. "This was my place," he said, his voice low. "I built it to be alone." He looked at her, his eyes holding an intensity she had never seen before. "It is not my place anymore. It is our home. I will not let him take it." The declaration hung in the air between them. It was more than a promise to protect the land. It was a promise to protect the life they had begun to build upon it, together. She put down her knife and the stone. She reached out and for the first time initiated a touch, her fingers resting lightly on his forearm. The contact was electric, a current of shared resolve. "We will not let him take it," she corrected him softly. In her simple addition of a single word, she had claimed him as much as he had claimed her. The confrontation they had been bracing for came sooner than expected. Caleb was repairing a section of the corral fence when Flint rode up, this time with two other rough-looking men. They did not stop at a distance, but rode straight up to the adobe, their intentions clear. Iska was inside, but Caleb knew she would be at the window, rifle in hand. "Morning, squatter," Flint called out, his voice full of false cheer. "Came to make you an offer. $500 for the claim, the house, and everything in it," he smirked. "Including the girl." Caleb slowly put down his hammer and turned to face them. He did not reach for the pistol on his hip. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his body a picture of calm, contained strength. "There's no claim to buy," Caleb said, his voice even. "And my wife is not for sale." The word wife came out of his mouth with a rightness that startled even him. It was a public declaration, a line drawn in the dust. Flint's eyes narrowed. "Wife? There ain't no preacher for 100 miles. Don't lie to me." "I'm not," Caleb said simply. He saw a flicker of movement at the window of the adobe. Iska stepped out of the door, the rifle held loosely in her hands, pointed at the ground. She did not look frightened. She looked furious. She walked to stand beside Caleb, her shoulder almost touching his. It was a clear, unequivocal choice. She was standing with him. Her presence changed the dynamic completely. Flint and his men had come expecting to intimidate a lone man. They were now facing a united front. "This is our home," Iska said, her voice ringing with a strength and clarity that made Flint's men shift uneasily in their saddles. "You are not welcome here. Leave." Enraged by their defiance, reached for the gun on his hip. But Caleb was faster. He didn't draw his own pistol. Instead, he lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of Flint's rifle from its scabbard on his saddle. With a powerful wrench, he tore it free and threw it far into the chaparral. At the same time, Iska raised her own rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked loud in the sudden silence. Flint's men froze, their hands raised. They were hired muscle, not men willing to die for Flint's greed. Defeated and humiliated, Flint stared at Caleb and Iska, his face a mask of hatred. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Yes," Caleb said, his voice cold as stone. "It is." He and Iska stood their ground, two figures united against the threat, as Flint and his men turned their horses and rode away, leaving them in a cloud of dust and the ringing silence of victory. They had chosen each other, not in a church, but on the sun-baked earth of the home they had defended together. After Flint and his men disappeared over the horizon, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbed away, leaving a trembling silence in its wake. Caleb turned to Iska. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. The rifle was still held tightly in her hands. He reached out, not to take the weapon, but to gently cover her hands with his own. His thumb stroked her knuckles until he felt the tension in her fingers begin to release. "It's over," he said softly. She nodded, allowing him to take the rifle and lean it against the corral fence. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection now that the danger had passed. He saw the tremor that ran through her. The aftermath of bravery was often a quiet, private collapse. He led her back inside the cool, dim adobe, away from the harsh glare of the sun and the memory of the confrontation. He sat her down in a chair and went to the water barrel, soaking a clean cloth in the cool water. He knelt in front of her, just as he had seen her kneel in the garden, and gently began to wipe the dust and sweat from her face and hands. It was an act of quiet service, of aftercare. His touch was incredibly tender, a silent communication of his gratitude, his relief, his profound devotion. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, allowing herself to be cared for. When he was finished, he didn't move away. He stayed kneeling before her, holding the damp cloth, his gaze fixed on her face. "The word I used," he began, his voice rough. "Wife, I spoke it to protect you, but it was not a lie. Not in my heart." Iska opened her eyes. They were luminous, filled with an emotion that mirrored his own. "In my heart," she whispered, "I have been your wife since you gave me a blanket in the storm." He reached out and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The guarded, stoic man who had built a fortress of solitude was gone. In his place was a man who had found something more valuable than peace. He had found a home in the heart of another. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of absolute intimacy. They stayed that way for a long time, breathing the same air, their hearts beating in the same quiet rhythm, the ugliness of the outside world fading away until nothing was left but the tender, unshakable truth of their bond. The dust settled, both literally and figuratively. Flint was not seen again. The story of his humiliation at the hands of the stoic homesteader and his fierce Apache wife likely spreading far enough to keep him away for good. The quiet rhythm of their lives returned, but it was different now. The foundation had been tested and had held. The unspoken questions had been answered. They were no longer two solitary people sharing a space. They were a family. The change was felt in small, profound ways. He started calling her by a private name in her own language, a word she had taught him that meant heart of the sky. She began to hum more often, not the sad, mournful tunes of her past, but lighter melodies that spoke of a heart at peace. The adobe, once a sterile shelter, became a true home. She wove a small, colorful rug for the floor and planted bright desert flowers in pots by the door. He built her a proper table and 2 sturdy chairs, so they no longer had to eat sitting on stools or the floor. One afternoon, she found him carefully mending the delicate beadwork on one of her old moccasins, a task that required a patience and gentleness that she knew was reserved only for her. He looked up, a little embarrassed to be caught at such a tender task. She simply smiled, a full, unguarded smile that lit up her whole face, and placed a hand on his shoulder. That night, a chill wind blew down from the mountains, a harbinger of the coming winter. As they sat by the fire, he looked at her, at the woman who had walked out of the desert and into the very center of his life. "The winter will be hard," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We have enough," she replied, her confidence in him absolute. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing the lines on her palm. "I will keep you warm," he said. It was not just a promise about the coming cold. It was a vow, spoken in plain, simple speech. It was a promise to protect her, to cherish her, to stand by her through all the seasons to come. She brought his hand to her cheek, holding it there. "And I you," she whispered, her own vow sealing his. Their future was not a grand, mapped-out journey, but a quiet, shared path, one footstep at a time, into the rest of their lives. The seasons turned. The harsh, sun-bleached landscape of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. Life on the homestead settled into a deep, comfortable intimacy. Caleb and Iska moved around each other with the effortless grace of 2 people whose souls were in tune. Their conversations were often wordless, a shared glance across the room, a hand offered to help with a heavy load, a cup of hot broth left on the workbench. He taught her to read the few books he owned, his large finger tracing the letters, his voice a low murmur beside her. She taught him the stories of her people, the names of the constellations, the meaning of the hawk's cry. They were weaving their 2 separate worlds into a single shared tapestry. He came to see the desert through her eyes, no longer as a barren wasteland to be endured, but as a place of subtle beauty and fierce resilience, a reflection of the woman he loved. She came to understand his silence not as a lack of feeling, but as a deep well of emotion that he revealed only to her, in the gentleness of his touch and the steadfastness of his gaze. One day, while clearing out a small, dilapidated shed, he found an old, tarnished silver locket. It was empty, a forgotten relic from a previous life. He spent a week carefully cleaning and polishing it, and braided a strong, thin cord of leather for it. One evening, he gave it to her. It was not an apology for the life she had lost, but a promise for the life they were building. "So you can carry us with you," he said simply. She opened it, seeing their 2 reflections, distorted and tiny, in the polished silver. She closed it, the soft click a sound of finality, of acceptance. She allowed him to place it around her neck, her head bowed, a gesture of profound trust. It was a gift given as a devotion, a symbol of their found family. They had been brought together by tragedy and circumstance, but they had chosen to stay, to build, to love. The ragged girl who had asked for shelter had become the heart of his home, and the lonely man who had sought only solitude had found his entire world in her. Winter arrived, blanketing the desert in a surprising hush. The work moved indoors, a time of mending, of planning for the spring, of simply being together. The adobe was their sanctuary, the fire in the hearth a constant, warm presence against the cold. The thin walls no longer felt like a constraint, but like an embrace, holding their shared life. The love between them was a quiet, steady thing, expressed not in grand passions, but in the small, sacred rituals of their daily existence. It was in the way he would rise first to build up the fire, so the room was warm when she awoke. It was in the way she would save him the best piece of dried meat, knowing his labors were greater than hers. Their devotion was a lived, breathed reality, as essential as water and as constant as the rising sun. One evening, as a cold wind rattled the door, they sat together on the floor before the fire, sharing a blanket. She was leaning against him, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm securely around her. The weight of her was a comfort, a grounding presence that had become essential to his being. He looked down at her, at the way the firelight played across her features, and his heart was filled with a sense of peace so profound it almost overwhelmed him. He had spent years seeking silence, only to find that the truest peace was not in the absence of sound, but in the quiet breathing of the person beside him. "Iska," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She tilted her head to look up at him. "Do you ever think of leaving? Of finding other people?" Her gaze was steady and clear. She reached up and touched his jaw, her fingers tracing the rough line of his beard. "My people are gone," she said, her voice soft but firm. "My home is here." She rested her hand over his heart. "My home is you." He lowered his head, resting his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. It was the only answer he had ever needed. He was a protector, a man who had shown his love through service and strength. She was a survivor, a woman who had wanted only safety and dignity. In the heart of the vast, lonely desert, in a small house built of earth and water, they had found everything they were looking for in each other. Their future was sealed not with a spoken vow, but with the quiet, unshakable promise of a shared heartbeat in the warm, firelit dark.